Hello, my online learners. This is Chapter 7, Part 2. When we look at muscles, muscles have a need for a lot of fuel because they're moving. And ATP cannot be stored in great detail. However, in the muscles, you can store oxygen and you can also store glucose in the form of glycogen. So glycogen will be stored in your muscle. And then when the body needs it, it'll be broken down. So the body stores glucose, and where it waits to be converted, it stores glycogen when it waits to be converted to glucose, which it will use for its energy. Now, sprains and strains are very common in muscles, and it's caused by the overstretching of a tendon or a muscle. And it can be mild or severe. Now, there's price, ice, and rice. Price is protect, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. Rice is rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And ice is just ice, compression, and elevation. And these are ways to decrease the swelling because the cold will help to allow less fluid into the area. Compression helps push fluid out, and elevation gets the fluid back to your heart. Okay. Now, there's some diseases there that I would like you to just look through, just so you know. But when it comes to diseases with sprains, you have pain, tenderness. Basically, you price, pressure, rest, ice, compression, and protection, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And you can also use things such as ultrasound. You can use electricity on it, but usually ice and when ice and rest and gentle movement and anti-inflammatory medication usually. Okay. There are a couple of common diseases there. Just look at them, just so you're aware. They won't be tested. And that's the end of Chapter 7. So it's kind of a short one with the exception of needing to know the muscles. Okay, thank you.